Have you ever wondered why some campaigns feel alive and full of drama and others fall flat? Well, today on the Wizards of Eem podcast, we're going to be talking about factions and how you can seriously raise your game's stakes with friends, foes, and intrigue.
Welcome back to the Wizards of Eem podcast. I'm Ben Costa. That's James Parks, and we're the creators of Land of Eem. And like James said, we're getting into factions today. So with factions, they really deepen the world. You know, you have various groups and organizations all with their own goals, motivations, enemies, allies, and it's a lot to play with and a lot to experience and immerse yourself in a world.
Yeah, and it doesn't need to be at all overbearing. You don't have to structure your factions in such a way to make it so that the PCs have to fully engage or totally understand every element of the factions. What we like to do when we're developing factions is we like to raise the stakes simply by having a faction have a motivation that may or may not align with the PCs, and another faction that has a motivation that may or may not align with PCs or that other faction. You find the PCs and the group will almost create the conflict for you as their role-playing solutions to their quest or their problems.
Yeah, you run into the classic like Yojimbo plot where you've got the PCs coming into a situation where two factions are at odds with each other, and the PCs play them off of each other by, lying and, making deals and whatever.
Right. And if things don't go according to plan, which they rarely do, you find yourself amping up that drama and conflict and creating intrigue as the factions and the characters associated with those factions start digging in on the PCs in different ways.
Factions really drive the story between all the rivalries, alliances, and betrayals. There's just endless possibilities for the PCs to go. And they're a great way to introduce the PCs to rumors and quests. Befriending a faction is probably the most classic way for a GM to bring new quests and rumors to the players and have them, work for an organization and kind of eventually meet people higher up and, get good standing within the organization, and new possibilities open up from there.
Right. Factions can create belonging for PCs, and they actually can be a great tool for a new PC who may not exactly know what direction they want to take their character. They can find themselves attaching themselves to a faction's motivations or goals, and then wanting to earn reputation with that faction and help that faction against other factions or other intrigues, which is, a great way to provide direction without being heavy-handed.
Yeah, in Land of Eem, we've got a couple that come to mind that I've noticed players often want to get involved with. You've got the Bulwarks, who are kind of this group of bog-roll paladins who rove the used-to-be forest and kind of protect people, fight the bandits that are rampant throughout the region. And then the Green Gallivant, who are mostly gnomes and other fairy folk, and just people who want to, save the environment. And that's always great introductions into all these different parts of the sandbox. It makes it super easy to reveal things about the world through the faction.
And speaking about like sandbox and world, one element that I like about factions is that they can actually provide some structure to what would appear endlessly emergent play. And what I mean by that is that factions are grounded in their motivations. They're grounded in what they're trying to accomplish and the people that they're contesting with to accomplish those goals. And when you're playing in a sandbox, it may seem like, you can do anything and you can do everything. Well, factions often create those barriers that prevent anything and everything because it becomes an issue with the faction that you encounter. And I like factions in any kind of emergent play or like a hex crawl or sandbox for that reason.
Yeah, some classic ones that come to mind in Star Wars RPGs, you've got your rebels and your empire.
Yeah.
And it's always useful as a GM to sort of present the Rebel Alliance, as it were, give them a whole bunch of different missions to choose from, ways to progress within the faction and maybe unlock like new player abilities and stuff like that.
Switching gears, I want to talk a little bit about some tips for building your own faction in a simple way. a lot of times you can kind of get lost in the world building and you build these complex organizations or complex networks of organizations, but it doesn't need to be that way to create a really compelling element of the gameplay. For one, what is the faction's goals? I would recommend keeping it really simple and clear. It's understandable that the rascals of Rascalton in the Land of Eem's river country, they want to rob the rich to feed the poor, essentially. They are dealing with overbearing, tyrannical river barons, and they're doing their best to siphon away those resources and tithes and taxes and gambling money back to the people who need it. Really clear, simple motivations help a PC instantly understand what that faction is all about.
And it helps a GM run the game, because we're not writing novels for these games. Like, we're not writing a novel when we write a faction. We want to make it super easy for a GM to just pick up and play and instantly know how to run it, what the goals are, who the major players are, give each faction a single face, like the head of the faction, who's the major player, the NPC who embodies all of its motives, and then a couple other major players to go along with that.
Yeah. And another element of that is you've got these characters that represent the faction. You've got a faction with clear goals and motivations. Well, the faction should feel alive as well. What is that faction doing when they're not on screen? Are they pursuing their goals? Are they pursuing stages of their goals? Here's where you could get a little bit creative to figure out what this faction might be up to if the PCs made one decision or made a different decision. Or
when the factions are kind of doing their machinations behind the scenes, that's always some of the most fun you can have as a game master, kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes. Like, what happens when the players sort of disregard a big plot element and go one way and do something else?
Right.
That faction advances their goals.
Imagine
changes
putting
the world.
Yes. Imagine putting like bullet points of progress meter or something, like a progress that the faction could make. Like, oh, the rascals, the big progress that they could make while the PCs are away, they could do a heist on this big riverboat. And that heist makes the river barons much more oppressive than before, or whatever it is. But like, I like to think of it as like, what are these little progress stages that the faction can go through to advance the story when the PCs are not engaged?
Yeah, and maybe to build on that, if the players just turn down the offer to go on this heist, maybe the heist is a failure.
They got to rescue the good old NPC representative of the faction. So there's a lot you could do with it, but it's not necessarily super creative heavy lifting that you need to do to introduce that kind of fun.
So as we kind of mentioned before, factions really promote player engagement with the faction. And one of the things that come to mind is like Star Wars. You got your Rebel Alliance, your Imperials. Often, if you're a player, you're going to be playing with the Rebels. You're getting missions from your boss, and maybe you're working your way up through the organization, and they can provide resources, and not to mention the quests and, safety nets, a place to rest, equipment, other NPCs to engage with. There's just like a whole world that gets opened up once players get in good with a faction, and it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and same for foes. Like, you could have a friendly faction or you can have an adversarial faction. The adversarial faction, obviously, that creates tension. It's they're trying to stop the PCs in some way or stop the organization the PCs are aligned with. But there's also a little bit of intrigue that you could introduce. Perhaps one of those foes actually wants to switch sides, or there's drama associated to one of your friends that wants to switch sides. These are all ways that you could really simply amp up a lot of the dramatic impact of the gameplay and create conflicts that may not on the surface be completely visible and be huge surprises for the PC. Factions come in all shapes and sizes. They could be a street gang, they could be a merchant guild, a noble house, a secret cult, a rebel army. They could be all kinds of different organizations and people that have their own motivations. In Land of Eem, we've got environmentalists, and we've got, Robin Hood-like characters, and we've got roaming peacekeepers and witches, and there's just so many different things you could do. And it doesn't necessarily need to be that all of their motivations are really thematic either. We have one faction in Land of Eem in particular that's actually Nork's Noodle Gang, which is a combination of like a fast food chain and gangster organization.
Yeah.
And they
Expand
often
the
blur the
business by
lines.
force.
Yeah, expand the business by force. That often blurs the line, and it leads to, tension, but also a little bit of hilarity.
Yeah, and you don't always have to think about these factions as like Game of Thrones warring entities that are constantly fighting each other. Like in
Right.
Land of Eem, there's very little war, but we've got organizations that are vying for resources, for economic power, territory, but it doesn't always end up in giant battles. It can be political, it can be, smaller scale things. I think back to the pirate court in the Scalawag Strand region, where normally you've got these 3 pirate factions that are kind of at odds with each other, but sort of have a loose alliance as pirates. But
They follow the rules of the pirate court, of course. I mean,
right. They've got this code of pirates, but in the sandbox, they come together as sort of a singular faction to take on the Daggerheart pirates. No relation to the game. We wrote it years before that.
Let that be stated for the jury that we're not copying anybody. We wrote it a long time ago.
But anyway, this landscape that's normally like a free-for-all chaos between pirates is sort of, different now because there's this one group that's taken power and the other ones kind of want to stop them. And how do the players interact with that? In our actual play, you guys ended up allying with the Barking Butchers or someone, and chartered a ship and sort of a stealth mission on the seas.
Yeah, all about vying for the resources, and essentially once being a powerful pirate organization that got bullied out of their trade by an even bigger, badder pirate organization. All the while, you've got Muckland Harbor. They're trying to figure out the pirate threat, and there's just all these little plot threads that weave together and can create interesting role-playing challenges when you're bouncing from one faction to another and trying to navigate all of it without yourself getting in too much trouble.
Yeah, honestly, without fact, the game world would feel really bare and just a lot less possibility as a player.
It also doesn't feel alive. And we talk about that a bunch on the podcast in general, and we talked about at the beginning of this episode, but it doesn't feel alive because when you're traveling, especially in a sandbox or an emergent play, you're traveling around and, I encounter a trap. I encounter goblins that instantly want to stab me. I encounter a bear. At some point you have to encounter people that are trying to get things done in this world, or else it doesn't feel like anything but a giant wilderness. And why do the goblins want to stab you? What's their motivation? Just to take your gold? For what purpose? To go to a town with no mayor and no depth to it? And so creating factions is we think a really effective way to generate a lot of depth for a game world without going too deep on the world building and focusing it all on those motivations that drive different people in a world to do the things that they do. Because it's motivations that drive the PCs. It's motivations that drive the GM to put together an adventure for the PCs. Make sure that everybody that they're interacting with has some stakes. They've got their cards ready to play in this game, and they're ready to bet, and they're ready to do things. It really helps to get players engaged.
And it really comes down, I think, to characters. And I feel like we say this a lot in our videos.
The characters and conflict.
But it's true. It's less about the overarching plots, but it's like, what are the motivations of the characters in the faction, and how is that always going to inform how these factions interact with each other and the players? It's not about, writing these really in-depth plots as a GM. It's propping up these entities that all have motivations and seeing how they play in a sandbox. And you may not know everything at first at all, but you learn to sort of pull the strings as the players engage.
I totally agree. And speaking of the GMs, we want to introduce just a couple of tips to tackle factions, because I totally understand. It's like, oh gosh, I got to create all these factions and this giant web, and you don't. It's simpler than that. Like Ben said, it's about the characters. Try to create 2 factions, maybe 3, and start with a character and what that character wants, and assume that character is part of an organization that shares their vision for what they want and what they want to achieve, and just start with 2 or 3, and maybe those factions they think different things about each other. Maybe they're at odds. And then you'll realize that you've created this like mini drama without an enormous amount of creative work, so that you now have a way for PCs to engage with these backstories and to invest in one faction, two factions, or maybe none of the factions. Maybe the factions are adversarial to the PCs in some way, and they got to go the way of Yojimbo, like we talked about at the beginning, which is personally, I always have to like temper myself from always going the Yojimbo route, because I just always think like, okay, I got to be like Toshiro Mifune. I'm going to get these guys to destroy each other because they're bad. I love it so much.
Another thing you could do is tie the PC's backstory to one of the factions. So there's this baked in thing right when you start playing. Encourage your player just to do that, give them information about the faction during character creation.
Or maybe a workshop a faction with the PCs.
Yeah, even better.
Yeah. And the last bit of advice I'd say is let the factions evolve. Think about those like little stages of success that the factions might have if they got their way. Just hearken all the way back to the Rascals and Rascal. They go on this big heist, but it fails because the PCs didn't help them out. Now their NPC leader has been captured by the River Barons, and that faction and the NPCs, they got to rescue their person, and it just changes the dynamics.
I hope you take away factions aren't just, an afterthought. They're not just window dressing. They're story engines that drive the story, that engage the players. And for a GM, they are a tool that can help you reveal the world to your players and keep your players really engaged.
Yeah. So if you want to see your engagement in a game increase, try sprinkling in a faction this week or in your next game and see what happens. Anyway, thanks for joining us for the Wizards of Eem podcast. If you're interested in checking out Land of Eem, go to landofeem.com. You can download our free quick start guide. Our books are on sale, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye now.
Farewell.